In this video, we will review previous steps taken as one flowing conversation about manufacturing measurements. As we go, we will introduce some new concepts, including guidelines for plural attributes, promotion of attributes to entities, and another source of intersection entities other than the evolution process shown in the last video. For this video, I'd like you to draw on a sheet of paper. The model will be really small, so you can always digitize your notes later if you like. For this topic, I'll introduce a new example, which will let us review the process from the beginning. But, unlike previous videos, instead of giving you review questions at the end, I'm going to ask you to follow along more interactively. I'd like you to do two things. One is to try to predict the questions before I ask them. The other is that as the users give us answers, I'd like you to document the answers using LDS. We're in a manufacturing setting, and we're going to make a model about measurements. We're meeting with users. What's the first thing you say? First thing you say is, tell me about measurements, and maybe manufacturing. Now suppose we've discussed for a while and gave it good context, but we've gotten a bit off track. We want to ask a more specific question to start the modeling process. What can we ask at this point? We can ask, what kinds of things do we want the system to remember? The users are focused, and they simply answer measurements. Now we know our starting point. We have an entity name. So I'll ask you, as scribe, to start writing down LDS for this conversation. I'll slow down a bit and let you keep up. To start filling in descriptors, what do we ask the users next? We can ask, what should we remember about each measurement? The users answer, value and units. Okay, scribe, please note that on the LDS. Now we want to get more out of the users. That's probably not everything yet. What can we ask now? We can ask, what else should we remember about each measurement? Maybe they give some more answers. Timestamp when it was taken, a gauge that it was taken with, the operator who took it. Take a moment to note these things on the LDS. Alright, let's get on the same page. By now I expect you to have noted an LDS similar to this. A couple of things to point out here. Make sure it's not measurements plural, but measurements singular. Next, if you drew any of these words as entities instead of attributes, that's probably moving too quickly. We don't have enough information yet to know that any of these are entities. One oddball I'll point out is units. The user said units plural. Now, normally, anytime we're seeking descriptors, if the users mention a plural descriptor, that's a signal that we would want a separate entity with a chicken foot. Because for this process, we're not going to allow attributes to be plural. For example, when we were seeking descriptors about camera, the users said photos plural. So we could immediately create a new entity with a relationship and a chicken foot. However, with a little intuition about how measurements work, we can guess that it's unlikely there will be more than one unit per measurement, and that the users only said this casually. Regardless, we will want to check this with the users soon. If it turns out that we really do have more than one unit per measurement, we will want to handle that. What about gauge and operator? Those could be separate entities, but we don't know yet because we don't really know what those look like in terms of data. Alright, we have descriptors. What's the next step? Next step is to seek identifier. We really don't want to waste time exploring anything else until we get an identifier secured. We want to do it as soon as we can to avoid any confusion on what a measurement really is. What words do we use to ask the users about the identifier for measurement? We can ask, how do you distinguish two measurements from each other? Let's suppose the answer like this. We want to think of a measurement as having a unique operator and gauge. We sometimes have two different operators repeat the same measurement, sometimes with the same gauge and other times with different gauges, and we want to keep track of each combination so that we can study our measurement variation. The users are talking a lot about the operator and the gauge. From these comments, it sounds like those two make an identifier. This does not definitively mean that that set of two things is the identifier, but let's start with that. Now, the next step. Let's make sure we anchor our understanding. We'll work with the users to write down some instances. Give it a try on your sheet of paper. Please take a minute to create a new blank data table with open spaces where we can write down instance data. You can just include the words that we've found so far. Don't fill in any numbers or instance data yet. I'll let you pause the video at this point. Okay, when you're ready, I'll show what I have. I've got the attributes along the header row, which gives 5 columns across the table in width. You might have put gauge and operator first because they're identifying descriptors. That's fine, but it doesn't particularly matter what order they're in. As for the height, there's no exact number of rows that we should have. We can always add more. I drew in 4 rows for now. Alright, now let's ask the users, can you help fill in some example data? Now let's suppose we work with the users and fill in the table like this. Here we can see for now that each measurement listed in these examples has a unique gauge and operator combination. So that seems to check out. Also, there are examples of multiple measurements with the same gauge and multiple measurements with the same operator. So we know that those two descriptors cannot serve as the identifier by themselves, which is still a little more evidence that we're moving in the right direction. Caution here though, a table of examples should only give us some confidence in correctness. This table does not prove that our identifier is right, but writing this out could have proven the identifier is wrong, and so far it did not. There are a number of things that we could do next. Probably the best thing to do is further investigation into the identifier, especially because it has 2 descriptors, and that's a fairly interesting shape. But let's suppose the users interject here and ask, are we going to keep track of the date when the gauge was calibrated? With that type of question, the users are telling us that the gauge has its own descriptors, which implies that the gauge should be its own entity. It would be ideal to have them hold that question until our identifier for measurement is fully secure, but for the sake of discussion, let's respond to the question that the users just asked. We can do the step of promoting an attribute to an entity. That means we will transform gauge into an entity. Before showing you how, I'd like you to take a guess on your paper how you think this promotion to entity would work. Please take a moment to do that. Alright, so to do this, we're going to erase the attribute and add a related entity. The attribute was previously an identifying descriptor, so the link to the new entity will also need to be marked with a bar as an identifying descriptor. On the outward link, when promoting an attribute, we can right away either add a chicken foot if the attribute was plural, or no chicken foot if it was singular. Gauge was singular, so no chicken foot here. On the inward link, we will leave a question mark for a moment. Before looking into the question mark, we want to make sure we seek descriptors for gauge. To avoid confusion, we don't want to ask one versus many questions about a thing that we haven't otherwise described yet. So, we'll seek descriptors. What should we remember about each gauge? The users list off some things: serial number, gauge type, manufacturer, date calibrated. We confirm, and it's one measurement. That's another descriptor of gauge, or many measurements. The users confirm measurements, plural. And what do we ask next? How do you distinguish two gauges from each other? Well, each gauge has a unique serial number, so we note that. And now we've fully promoted our attribute into a new entity with its own descriptors and identifier. Yay! I won't go through the conversations for all of these, but there are a few different motivations for promotion of a singular non-plural attribute. One is that the attribute has its own descriptors, like when the users spoke up about there being a date calibrated on the gauge. Another is that the attribute might be used in more than one place on the model. If we saw two different entities with an attribute called operator, we would want one entity to handle both. Finally, if the attribute's data is worth remembering in its own right, that's another reason to promote. Before we promoted gauge, we could only remember gauges as part of a measurement. No measurement, no gauge data. If the users want a database of gauges, including gauges that have never taken a measurement, this would be necessary for that reason too. What about operator? Do we want to remember a list of possible operators, even ones who have no measurement? We can imagine that the person inputting the data might need to select from a list of possible operators, even ones who have not yet taken a measurement. We can ask this of the users if they don't bring it up themselves. Let's suppose the users say, yes, we want to remember operators by themselves. About each operator, we should remember the first and last name and an employee ID. The users decide that the employee ID is a reasonable identifier for the operator, better than just using first and last name, because an operator could have the same first and last name as another operator. And each operator can take many measurements. A measurement is taken by one operator. Finally, the bar again is maintained because it was underlined before. Now, what kind of entity is measurement? What shape is this? This is an intersection entity. Chicken feet are inward. The identifier's bars are next to the chicken feet on the outbound links. Usually we reach this shape by evolving a many-many relationship, but I created this example to show that this shape can be reached in other ways as well. Regardless of how the shape is reached, the next step in the flow is the same, which is to seek a tiebreaker. I will cover that in the next video.